look at is just some of the ways the body physiologically responds to cold, both under normal conditions and then under exercise conditions, how this might affect performance. Like I've said in class a few times to those of you that have been there, in terms of actual cold adaptation, really we did not physiologically adapt to the cold. We're much more behaviorally adapted to the cold in terms of, as you can even see in this picture here, increased clothing, other things like that. Really what you see more than anything is more habituation responses. So increased cold tolerance, but really nothing in the way of actually improving anything at the cold. You're just not defending your set point as much, so you don't waste quite as much energy trying to shiver, but that's really about it. So I think what we'll do in these ones is just mainly look at the cold responses, and then we're going to switch over to a couple of the more fun physiology things to finish up the course here. So we're really kind of getting down to the end of it. So with acute cold responses, we know our body temperature really about that 37 degrees Celsius. You start getting much lower than that. No, like it says there, 27 degrees Celsius, humans really can't regulate at that temperature. Down, getting below 20, it is going to be fatal. You can see every once in a while someone can get down where they're very cold and survive that, but it's not particularly common. But this is kind of giving you the tissue response relative to the different environments here. So we have a number of things to kind of think about when we're looking at this. I mean, obviously the environment's playing a role in here. Are we talking about water versus air? Is there wind to increase that convectional heat loss? What is the overall temperature? We also then can look at the person's individual characteristics, age, amount of body mass versus muscle mass, surface to volume, adipose tissue layers, gender all play a role in how well somebody can deal with the cold. Clothing, if you're wet or dry, how much subcutaneous fat you have, and then we can also bring in heat production, either base metabolic rate or being active, as ways to kind of try to deal with those cold temperatures. Definitely things are going to play a role in this. We start looking at metabolic heat production. Body size is going to play a role. Generally, the larger the body is, the more metabolic heat producing you're going to be doing. That being said, lean body weight or lean body mass tends to have higher metabolism, so you're going to be generating more calories than somebody with that more lean body weight. The other thing we can look at is what is going on with the endocrine system, increased thyroxine levels, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are all things that would increase that base metabolic rate and stimulate increased metabolism, and that is going to generate more heat. Age and gender obviously play a role. Again, if you're having enough food to support the metabolic activity you're doing. Again, the environment will play a role on this as well. We can do shivering thermogenesis to try to deal with these cold environments. One of the things you need to be aware of when we start talking about, and it goes back to, again, that heat, like when we talked about in the increasing temperatures, and we talked about how the different ways you lose or gain heat. A lot of these are also going to be true in cold environments. So one of the things that is very key to us, anything that's more thermally conductive, so water versus air, we're definitely going to see greater heat losses in those water conditions relative to the air, just due to that increased thermal conductivity. Ideally, what we want going on is we want to be thermoneutral, where any heat loss we're doing is being balanced out by metabolic heat or vice versa. So there's going to be certain temperatures. So once your metabolism once your body temperature drops enough, you're going to get increased energy metabolism to try to make up for that. Again, depending on your insulating adipose layers, there's going to be a different threshold for this. Generally, in somebody who has a lot of lean body weight, your core temp and your body temp is going to be able to drop a couple degrees Celsius, where somebody who has a little bit more adipose tissue is going to have a lower set point. Like it says on the second point here, it is inversely related to subcutaneous body fat. Again, this is going to be a much higher temperature in water than it would be in air to start bringing on that thermogenesis type of shivering. And again, in air, there's going to be a lot more variability depending on wind levels, moisture in the air relative to water, which is going to be pretty consistent. So this is kind of showing you, this is looking at critical temperatures versus skin fold thickness. So obviously the more the skin you can fold over is going to say more adipose tissue. And what you can kind of see on these ones, that critical temperature tends to be lower as the skin fold thickness or that adipose layer tends to get thicker. And this is true in both air and water. The one thing we do notice, that critical temperature in the water is consistently about 8 to 10 degrees higher than it is in the air. So what are we looking at when it comes to acute responses in the cold? I think most people are aware of this. We're definitely going to have vasoconstriction, where you're pulling the blood flow away from those outlying areas, away from the shell. If you get cold enough, away from the extremities. I think everybody's experienced shivering on a cold day. We also have non-shivering thermogenesis, so going to be doing some type of metabolisms that are going to try to generate heat without causing shivering, and then not particularly functional in us, but pillow or erection is going to be involved in this as well. Vasoconstriction is pretty straightforward. That is moving blood away from those skin levels, so we're not vasodilating near the skin. We're going to constrict those vessels and really try to keep blood away from the shell as much as possible. Shivering metabolism is going to be probably one of our biggest generators of heat. The ability of us to do this is related to our VO2 max, and generally the higher VO2 max, the more heat you could probably generate with shivering. The real crazy thing is that when you're getting into those most violent types of shivering, it's about 50% of whatever your VO2 max is. And again, this VO2 max as a determining factor in the thermogenesis has probably somewhat to do with the fact that higher VO2 max is going to have more muscle mass relative to the overall body mass. And that might play a role in why that is a determining factor. And so this is a nice little one here that's showing you a number of different things that are going to be happening in response to this. So again, muscular system, we know shivering is going to produce internal metabolic heat. We know our subcutaneous fat is going to insulate the body. We are going to try to retain water and other things like that to offset any other water losses and try to not sweat. Cutaneous blood vessels are going to constrict. Outside of that, thyroid, adrenal hormones can increase your metabolic rate and play a role in which fuels you're going to be using. And a lot of this is being controlled by the hypothalamus, determining, based on what's going on in these other systems, what it should be doing in terms of these acting on these different effectors. But the main metabolic, main mechanisms, not metabolic, but the main regulatory mechanisms we're going to see here, you can look at it here. So the hypothalamus is taking a look at this. In response, we can increase thyrotropin releasing hormone, which is going to increase TSH. Increased TSH is going to give us increasing levels of, sorry, my cursor is not wanting to go where it's supposed to. Increasing levels of thyroxine from the gland, which is going to increase that metabolic heat production just through increased metabolic rate. Other regulatory mechanisms, skin and the spinal cord are feeding back to the brain, increasing our muscle tone above the critical level to start triggering thermogenesis in terms of shivering. And that shivering heat production can really increase our heat production 4 to 5 times over. The other thing that this is going to do within the hypothalamus is stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is going to stimulate vasoconstriction, as well as have a increased metabolic effect to generate more heat. So, and again, in a simple sense, we can see here is where we're taking this information in. We have these different sensory receptors in areas of the skin, the spinal cord, and different organs. They are sending all their information to that really integration center when it comes to dealing with temperature, which is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is really going to direct us through a number of different directions. One of the ways is endocrine-wise through the anterior pituitary to trigger both the adrenal cortex and the thyroid gland to release hormones, both of which are going to increase metabolic rate. The hypothalamus through the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause vasoconstriction as well as act on the adrenal medulla to do more epinephrine and norepinephrine to, again, trigger increases in metabolic rate. And then finally, through the motor nerves, they can act on the skeletal muscles to do that shivering thermogenesis by using oxygen to generate heat. So the big thing that's influencing a lot of this, though, is how are we losing this heat? So when we're getting into cold environments, how we're losing heat is going to play a role in really what can we do to deal with it. Again, external heat loss mechanisms are pretty straightforward. It is going to be, really a lot of it is, what are the differences in the temperature relative to the body, how long you're being exposed, what is the thermal conductivity, is it water or air, is there moving currents past you? These are all things that are going to influence that external heat loss. Your body shape as well as body mass and insulation layers are also going to affect this. Internally, what's going to play a role in this is, again, if you have more adipose tissue, that is going to insulate and is going to really limit the flow of heat from the core to the shell, which is good in cold temperatures, is not particularly good in hot temperatures. But increased body fatness will actually decrease heat flow to the shell and limit your heat loss. So heat loss and duration of exposure. Again, relative to air, water is going to be much more rapid. Again, this is due to that thermal conductivity. Water temperature, if it drops, it will definitely very quickly decrease that core temperature. And like it says here, increase in duration will lower the core temperature, but this is not a very linear thing. What we're going to see is, and I wish I could still get to some of these videos that the one Stanford thing was doing, but what you'll kind of see is the body will try to, through metabolic heat production and limiting heat loss, we generally will try to stabilize for a while in temperatures and manage this for a while until the body can no longer compensate. So this is much more like when somebody is crashing, where the body will try to compensate until it loses its ability to. So a lot of times in these cold temperatures, we will get this initially a rapid decline, then it will stabilize and really hold temperature pretty well for a while. Before, again, if the temperature keeps dropping, we have a very rapid decline at the end. So again, much like we saw when we were talking about heat, that different heat balance equation does play a role here. Convection is going to definitely play a role. So the more body surface area you have exposed, increased body surface area is going, for a particular given exposure, is going to decrease core temperatures. Then the faster that air is moving, the quicker this is going to happen, or the faster that liquid is moving, the quicker this is going to happen. And like it says here, the greater the body surface area to the body weight ratio. So if you have more surface area relative to your body weight, so you are not carrying a lot of mass, you have thin limbs, not a big barrel chest or other stuff like that, those type of people are going to have a greater decrease in core temperature for a given exposure. Someone who is going to have shorter limbs, bigger kind of core areas or trunk areas, those folks are going to tend to have, for a particular given exposure, lower body surface area to body weight ratio, and then tend to maintain their heat better. And this really gets into that body shape, and this is, again, it's one of the things that I was talking about when it came to heat dissipation and athletic events. We talked about how Kenyans and Ethiopians tend to have that ectomorphic type of body style, where not a large trunk, longer limbs relative to their body, again, less body mass, where somebody that's more endomorphic, that rounder shape, or mesomorphic, more kind of in the middle, those folks tend to have better cold tolerance. They're carrying a little bit more volume relative to their body size, which again, body mass to body surface area. Endomorphic and mesomorphic are going to have less surface area relative to their body weight. Because of that, they tend to tolerate the cold better. This is part of the reason, like I've given the example of a couple of times, of running the Boston Marathon in 2012. It was super hot and the Kenyans did really, really well. Then a couple years ago when Des Linden won it, that was the year it was about 30 degrees and it snowed and rained during that one. And if you really look, the Kenyans in that one with those ectomorphic body shapes, as a generalization, tended to do worse in that one. Really because they were having a difficult time staying normothermic and not going hypothermic. Where those folks that had a little bit more of this endomorphic or mesomorphic shape were doing a little bit better in that one relative to those folks. And generally, like I said, lean body weight is good at heat production. Lean body weight is also going to give you a decent body surface area to body weight ratio, both of which are pretty good on this one. If you have more fat weight, it is going to increase with the cold tolerance, but it generally also means greater surface area to body weight ratio, which is not always helping that cold tolerance. So it really is a balancing act with this insulation. One of the things you'll see it definitely in water, and this is one of the things, if you actually go through the book I got you, and it talks about cold water rescue and some of the things like that. If you're in really cold water and you're not particularly close to shore, your best bet is to stay stationary. In really cold water, there is a layer of water that actually stays close to the skin, and if you don't move that water, you've warmed that water up a little bit. It's providing a little bit of insulation to the other cold water around that. If you start moving your arms around, moving your legs around a ton, you are going to increase the convection here and bringing colder water closer to the body, which will actually increase convective heat loss. So in water, if you can stay stationary, it will help you out a little bit. If you don't believe this, try an ice bath and try an ice bath with a circulator. You will definitely feel the difference. And like I said, the more you move that water, the more it decreases that insulation and is going to increase convective heat loss. It does sometimes, like it says there, decrease skin temps as well, which will give you a lesser gradient, but again, moving around in this cold water is generally going to be a detriment, not something that's going to help you out in the long run. They generally say with water rescue, if you're in ice cold water, if you're not within 800 meters of shore, you are best off not to try to swim for shore and hope for rescue, because you will become hypothermic and likely drowned before you can swim to shore. That your muscle movements will become uncoordinated and you will not be able to stay afloat. Obviously, the more water temperature there is, the colder the water is, the more it can increase this convective heat loss. And again, in the water, if you are moving through it, you tend to cause more water to move past you, so you're getting this kind of forced convection. This is going to tend to move that past you more, and as well as get rid of that insulatory water around you. That is going to cause more water, not more water, but more cold, more heat to be pulled from the body. So again, If you're in really cold conditions and you're not close to shore, your best bet is to stay stationary in that water, move as little as possible to stay afloat. The more you move, the more heat you're going to lose quicker. The other thing is, when you are exercising, it doesn't allow you to vasoconstrict. It forces vasodilation to supply those muscles, which means those muscles, if they've got below normal core temp, are going to act as heat sinks, and they're going to take a bunch of that core heat and pull them into that muscle to warm that muscle up. We know exercise does increase metabolic heat production, but the main thing on this one is, in these cases, is whatever you're doing, if you're exercising, that has to be generating more heat than loss. Otherwise, you are going to lose temperature and you're going to become hypothermic. So that heat production has to be greater than the increase in heat loss from convection and losing the insulating water layer. So again, it's a balancing act, and that's why they say generally in cold water, if you're not close to shore, you don't try to make it. Again, a lot of this in the cold air is not going to be the same thing. Yes, in cold air, we are going to lose heat through convection as well, especially on really cold, windy days with that high wind chill. This can definitely be a problem. That being said, ambient air temperatures can be much, much colder than water temperatures that the human body can withstand. So definitely below 0 Fahrenheit, 10, 20 below air temperature is not going to be nearly as bad as just 32-degree water in terms of heat loss to the body. The other thing that we have going that the body's going to try to do here is we are going to try to vasoconstrict, obviously, to the skin, but then as we get colder and colder, we are going to start pulling blood, or limiting blood flow to these extremities. So again, what we start doing more and more is letting these extremities go to ambient temperature in this water or air. That is going to prevent heat loss and keep more of it to the core. We can get actually what is referred to as physiologic amputation. There is times in cold enough environments, so it's happened to people climbing Everest and things like that, where the body, to maintain core temp, will basically stop sending blood to a hand or to fingers, and you will get frostbite and lose those fingers because they will actually freeze. So we can vasoconstrict quite a bit to maintain this, and I'm sure everybody's kind of felt that when your hands get numb and your hands get really cold in these kind of cold environment or cold days. Like it says here, within the body at rest, generally heat loss from the trunk is greater than the extremities. Again, definitely due to decreased blood flow to the extremities. I mean, really, our biggest heat loss is going to be through the head, which we have to send heat to that, but it is an extremity, so we tend to lose a lot of our heat through that. But then it's going to be the chest and the back, those main surface areas where we're going to lose heat from. Again, fat is going to provide insulation, much more so than muscle or the skin. And that subcutaneous fat is going to help conserve heat. But again, it's a balancing act. If you have enough of that, you don't have that increased lean body weight, which is going to generate heat. So it's a balancing act between insulation and heat production. The more fat you have isn't necessarily always going to be more warmth. So how can we gain heat? One of the ways we can do this, there is what is called brown fat. So we can increase metabolism in brown fat tissue. This is kind of almost like a dysregulated type of cellular respiration. It's very inefficient. It tends to generate heat more than energy. The other thing that we can see is different hormones. Cold exposure is going to trigger epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroxine release, as well as glucocorticoid release. Maybe in a more of an unadapted person or somebody who's not used to the cold. But the main thing is these increased catecholamines, so epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroxine, these are all things that are going to have a calorogenic effect. It's going to cause you to burn calories, which means you're going to generate heat. Our biggest production of heat, though, is going to be shivering thermogenesis. So shivering can generate quite a bit of heat. And again, that with that vasoconstriction of the skin can keep this blood shunted to the core and can generate more heat and keep that heat to the core so we don't lose core temp. So again, shivering is the main mechanism for generating heat during these negative heat kind of balance situations where you're in very cold environments. It is an involuntary contraction of a voluntary muscle. Shivering can generate heat about 5 times of what the body does at rest, so it is a very efficient way to generate a lot of body heat. Again, you need to have the caloric needs necessary to support this, the nutrient levels necessary to support this, and again, it is a short-term thing. Over a period of time, shivering you cannot shiver indefinitely. It generates a lot of heat, but it requires a lot of energy, and over time, the body cannot maintain these high shivering levels for long periods of time. Just even the tensing of these muscles prior to even where you start shivering can increase heat about 50 to 100%. And again, this is effective because most of the energy here, you're not doing a lot of movement, you're just causing some tone to happen, which is going to generate heat, but not a lot of movement. So what we're doing on this one is almost all that energy that you're burning is going directly to heat. And this is going to increase the cardiac output by increasing the stroke volume, by having better venous return, which means we're moving that heat around within the core very well with our cardiac output. Again, what becomes important here, and like I said, the limits is already what I was kind of saying, is that those nutrient levels. If your blood sugar, your glycogen levels get too low, you're going to fatigue. Obviously, if you're at high environments, and this is why altitude and cold don't mix well, but hypoxia is going to limit the ability to shiver and to cause heat generation by these muscles because there's not enough oxygen to let that shivering happen. Obviously, other drugs or other things like that mess with this, like alcohol, it makes you feel warm, but it actually limits your ability to maintain body temp. So like I said before, this non-shivering thermogenesis is a lot of times these increase of these adrenal hormones as well as the thyroid gland. These tend to increase your base metabolic rate. Higher metabolic rates, metabolic reactions generate heat, and this is one of the ways for the body by just upping that base metabolic rate to generate a little bit more body heat. It's going to, like I said, thyroxine sets your idle, basically. If you increase thyroxine levels, you're going to have a higher idle in your body. This is going to generate more heat from really all cells of the body. As I was already saying, those epinephrine, norepinephrine, they are also going to increase that body weight and free up some nutrients for that to happen, those free fatty acids. So this is that resting metabolic rate at different temperatures, and you can see at these kind of thermoneutral temperatures, the resting metabolic rate is quite low. If you start getting hotter, you can see things have to start happening to try to cool you down. But one of the things you notice here is in the cold, that resting metabolic rate goes up greatly. This is one of those things, if you were to go and look on, I'm trying to think if I have it on the page there or not, but there was one little survival book that was talking about. But one of the reasons why some of these Antarctic expeditions early on did not make it is just doing a little bit of work in really cold environments, just being in really cold environments in terms of that shivering thermogenesis and the increased metabolic rate. We're talking calorie needs that are sometimes double, triple what you would be at a normal thermoneutral type of thing. Then if you're doing something active, you're talking 3 to 4 times the caloric needs to maintain body weight. What you saw in some of these, like the Shackleton and some of these other Antarctic expeditions, is they basically starved to death. They weren't able to carry enough food to maintain their body weights, and really over time, they were really, in a way, eating their body. I mean, their body was pirating their tissues to maintain their temps and maintain these caloric needs. but you can only do that for so long. So again, we are going to see increased resting metabolic rates in the cold, but these are only sustainable if you're having the caloric intake necessary to support them. And again, these metabolic rate increases are not always going to be enough to offset this heat loss. And this is just kind of showing you that really you have these little areas of skin temperature where you're kind of in that thermoneutral zone. We can only vasodilate so much when we get hot, and then we start bringing that sweating. If we get to here, we can vasoconstrict, keep that away, but sooner or later we're going to have to start that shivering and non-shivering thermogenesis to try to generate more heat as skin temperatures get colder and colder. And again, you can see we can keep it pretty stable for a while, but again, you get too hot of conditions or too cold of conditions, we lose the ability to compensate for either the heat or the cold. A lot of times I refer to Q10 as the metabolic. It's the rate of physiological processes. Q10, like it says there, is the rate of physiological process at a particular temperature compared to the rate at 10 degrees lower. And again, metabolic rate, if we get it in the wrong type of thing here, it can be kind of self-perpetuating. You can get into a positive feedback loop where increased temperature causes greater increases in temperature, and this is where you can get kind of runaway body heat. So what we'll be looking at on the next one here, so this is kind of showing you that it's really shivering and some of the non-shivering thermogenesis along with vasoconstriction. These are really our main ways that we're trying to deal with the cold. Again, and it's really cold air versus cold water, greater thermoconductivity in the water, convective heat loss, so that heat balance equation comes back in again. The greater thermoconductivity of the fluid that's on us, how fast it's moving, are all going to be things that influence how great that heat loss is. What we're going to look at in the next one here is start taking a look at exercise in the cold, and is it performance decreasing, is it not, why might that be the case?